Well, it certainly starts with my father, who had two wives, and he had a separate family back in China, and my mother was his second wife. And in his lifetime, he wrote letters almost every month and sending some money every month back to the first wife in China. The first wife never left home. She was duty bound to stay at home to look after the firstborn. And the reason being is that both my father and the first wife were products of the old Qing dynasty. And that was the way they did things in those days, was that the wife would stay at home and the husband would go out into the new world to make a living and send money back to support the family in China. And sometimes the husband would go back to China, but in the case of my father, he stayed here and he married my mother. But when my parents started to have children, the interesting thing was that when each of my siblings were born, they took each of them back to China to be introduced to my, or rather to my father's first wife, because in the old Chinese society, the first wife was the mother of all subsequent children, regardless who my father married. So each of my siblings, other than myself, went back with my parents to the first wife to be introduced. And so because there were four siblings, there were four trips going back to China. I was born in 1938, a little late because at that time Japan was at war with China. So, but in 1940, my parents decided to go back to China because they felt they were needed going back to the home village. But unfortunately, my mother took sick and she passed away, and my father cashed in the passage money and shipped her remains back to China. Now, the interesting thing about that story is that when my father sent for my mother back in 1921, she arrived on a Canadian Pacific steamship called the Empress of Asia. When she died, her remains went back on the Empress of Asia, the very same ship that brought her here to begin with.